If not, today we get a chance to hear from one of our MSMC scholars and hear a little bit about the passions and interests that drive him, a little bit about the work that he's been doing and how he can share it with us here in the room or there at home in Zoom land. So we get this chance to hear a little bit about the things that our faculty and our community are working on, engage in some dialogue, ask some questions, and see really the process of research and scholarship, because it doesn't just exist. We don't just go to a database and find it. It's a process, and we get to participate in that conversation today, which is excellent. A few housekeeping notes. As you see, we are recording. Please keep your microphones muted at home. If you're here in the room, please make sure your phone is on mute as well. You can keep your camera off or on, it's optional. If you're here for FYE credit, please do put your name, your MSMC ID number, and your email into the chat, and we'll get your attendance there. Closed captioning is available as well. You'll see down the CC button. We'll give that to you as well. We'll get some questions at the end. We'll get the chance to either ask them through the chat here in the room or raise your hands, use that function, and I'll call on you to unmute. We will be, after this is recorded, posting it to our wonderful MSMC YouTube channel, where you can find many of our other sessions recorded, things like DEI and sports. We recently heard about the effective expertise on eye movements and trained musicians. And some really interesting stuff there, so be watching for that. And join us again in a couple of weeks, March 27th, we're gonna be having our next iROC event. I'm John Damrow. I always forget that part to introduce myself. I hope many of you know me, but maybe not all. On behalf of myself and the rest of our iROC team, that's Vivian Milzarski in the chat, our library director, and Evan Markhofer, associate professor of biology here at the Mount. Welcome to another edition of iROC. Today I get to present presenting his Faith and Reason and American Catholic Higher Education, Dr. Charles Zola, who you may know or may not. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from the University of Scranton, Master of Arts and Doctorate in Philosophy from the Catholic University of Louvain, Belgium. He's taught philosophy and ethics at the University of Scranton, Misericordia University, and Penn State University's Hazleton and Wilkes-Barre campuses. At Misericordia, he directed the Ethics Institute of Northeastern Pennsylvania and also served as a consultant and speaker for Temple University's Institute for Protective Services. He began teaching in the Mount in 2009, where he also serves as the assistant to the president for mission integration and directs the Catholic and Dominican Institute. His areas of interest are Thomistic philosophy, applied ethics, and the Catholic intellectual tradition. Please welcome Dr. Charles.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here this afternoon and offer an analysis of the topic of faith and reason in contemporary American Catholic higher education. Although our time is short and the theme almost a millennium old, it is good to explore this topic as it speaks to our identity here at Mount St. Mary College. Before I begin, I want to thank Evan Markhofer and his committee for their efforts in arranging the iROC series, and also a special thank you to John Damrow, who had a very gracious introduction, and to Michael McGuire for assisting me in my research efforts and for tracking down sources of information for this talk. In this talk, I will offer a brief overview of the historical development of higher education as it evolved in the Western intellectual tradition, followed by an exploration of the relationship between faith and reason as it is understood in the Catholic intellectual tradition. I will then offer a perspective on how this relationship is best understood in the current context of American Catholic higher education, with a special focus on our campus culture here at Mount St. Mary College as a Catholic college in the Dominican tradition. The subject of my talk was generated 2 summers ago during a visit to Yale University for the first time. Although I like to explore unfamiliar academic campuses on my own, given the size and history of Yale, I decided that the best introduction would probably be a guided tour. Our tour was led by a bright and energetic young sophomore who was a music and theater major. As expected, the guide began with a brief description of the founding of Yale University. Although he did not go into much detail, he explained that the school was founded by a minister and was intended to serve as a seminary. However, in the course of time, the mission of the school had expanded beyond that original intent. The tour was complete, meandering the streets and the courts of the university's physical infrastructure, passing dorms, classroom buildings, and student gathering spots. However, the one location that most captured my attention was the stop and the tour of the Sterling Memorial Library. Our guide explained that the architect had purposely designed it to imitate the Gothic style of medieval cathedrals, and it was to be understood as a cathedral dedicated to scholarship. The campus already had a chapel for religious services, but there needed to be another building that would be dedicated to the honor and glory of the pursuit of truth. I do have a handout and advancing slides here. Let's see. A little technical assistance, please, just to advance.
Yeah, you should be able to. Yeah, you should be able to up and down.
Is this one? Okay. This one? Oh, okay. Thank you. So I do have a handout, and the handout gives a nice description of the Sterling Memorial Library. Practically speaking, two distinct buildings are necessary as each serves a particular function, namely the chapel and the library. However, what intrigued me about my tour guide's comments was the way he articulated the complete separation and the purpose of the two buildings. It was clear that for him, that the life of the mind and the life of the soul were two distinct and separate realms. One had nothing to do with the other. That the Sterling Library had a reminiscence of a medieval cathedral was more a comment on an historical or architectural detail, rather than anything having to do with this shared vision of the unity of the intellectual and spiritual life. And so I hope these pictures capture the feeling that one gets when you first see this library. I mean, it's obviously in the Gothic style. And when you go into the library, as soon as you go in, you would really think it is a church. It's very much has that feeling of a nave, the high ceilings. And at the far end, most churches would have a high altar and the rood screen. The Sterling Library has that as well. So at the very far end of this long entrance nave, we see an allegory of education. And so the various disciplines are represented there. And in the center is sort of the apotheosis of the intellectual tradition. It's an absolutely beautiful building and definitely worth the visit and the trip to see it. But what intrigues you so much about this, it's really borrowing so much from the medieval Gothic Christian tradition. So his comments incited me to take a deeper dive into the matter. I discovered that the guide's account was quite abridged and missed important details. And of course, we can't fault the guide because, as we know, tour guides have to be very clear and concise. As a philosopher, we wanted to take a deeper dive. So according to Yale University Library's website, the earliest beginnings of the institution date back to the New Haven colony, founded by the Puritans in 1638, who fled Anglican persecution and wanted to set up a theocracy in the New World and a college to educate their leaders. The plans were squashed in 1656 by King Charles II, who ordered the colony to join the state of Connecticut. By 1700, a group of 10 clergymen had met in the small town of Branford, a few miles east of New Haven, and there they decided to dedicate books for the founding of a college in the colony. The following year, the governor and General Assembly met in New Haven and promulgated an act for liberty to erect a collegiate school. Part of its mission was to instruct the youths in art and sciences, fitting them for, quote, public employment both in church and in the state. Given this, the tour guide's words and indifferent attitude concerning the original linkage between the intellectual and spiritual life that had inspired Yale's founding became even more intriguing. I thought how strange and absolutely foreign was this philosophy of education from that of the Catholic intellectual tradition, which saw a harmony between the realms of faith and reason. Of course, I did realize that non-sectarian schools did not share this perspective. After all, I taught at Penn State. Their religion is football, and Joe Paterno, the patron saint. But Penn State's origins was a land-grant school. Unlike Yale, its founding was much different. At Yale, there was a religious motivation in its genesis, and yet it had become unanchored from that beginning. What happened? Thus began my exploration of how faith and reason ever became associated with formal education in the first place, and why, for some schools, that relationship had eroded over time. So the historical context of contemporary higher education. The early origins of what we now commonly refer to as higher education is traced to medieval Europe's monastic cathedral schools. Two figures of crucial importance in this regard are Saint Benedict and Casadoros. Saint Benedict, who lived from 480 to 547, established the monastery of Monte Cassino and was governed and regulated by a rule known as the Rule of Saint Benedict. The way of life eventually became a standard monastic tradition throughout the Christian world. The monastic life focuses members' attention on closer unity with God through community and formally dedicated lifestyle consisting of prayer, work, and spirituality. This also included study. Of note for us here at Mount St. Mary College, it was to the Abbey of Monte Cassino that the young St. Thomas Aquinas was sent by his family at around the age of 5 or 7, with the intention that he would eventually join the Benedictine order. And as we all know, that did not work out like his family had intended. God and Thomas had plans that were other than those. The second important figure is Casadoros, who lived from 485 to 585. He established a center of prayer and learning called the Vivarium on his private lands in southern Italy in the latter half of the 6th century. The location consisted of a cenobic monastery and retreat center, which permitted the monks and hermits to live together. Casadoros has composed a text entitled the Institutiones, which was intended to be a guide for reading both religious and secular texts, and were found in the site's library. The book was divided into 2 sections. The first dealing with the Christian writings and Psalms, but the second dealt with the Trivium and Quadrivium, or what we now commonly call the 7 liberal arts. The former consisting of grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, the latter consisting of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Benedict and Casadoros helped usher in the monastic form of life that spread throughout Europe, which emphasized and cultivated both the spiritual and intellectual life of the human person. These religious communities of men and women preserved a treasury of ancient theological and philosophical texts through their copying of manuscripts in the scriptorium, cultivated music, art, and the liturgical rituals upon which the life of the monk or the nun was based. It should also be noted that by necessity, these communities needed to be self-sustaining, and therefore had interest in horticulture and animal husbandry to maintain a food supply, and moreover, medicine and herbal remedies to treat the sick and dying were also essential interest, as well as astronomy in order to calculate the dates of Christmas and Easter. In tandem with the growth and spread of monasteries, cathedral schools were beginning to be established by bishops who wished to cultivate an educated clergy. The earliest one was established in 527 in Visigoth, Spain, by the Second Council of Toledo. Eventually, they spread to the newly established Diocese of England, Canterbury in 597, Rochester in 604, and York in 627. By 789, in an effort to reform and affirm the importance of education and religion, Charlemagne issued a series of legislative acts known as the Admonitio Generalis that required education be provided at monastery and cathedral schools to remedy the deplorable situation of an uneducated clergy and noble class, and where, quote, children can learn to read the Psalms, notation, chant, computation, and grammar be taught. The male children of the nobility interested in working for the state as clerks or diplomats or offices within the church attended these schools and studied the 7 liberal arts taught in Latin. In time, the cities of Chartres, Orléans, Paris, Utrecht, Liège, Cologne, Bamberg, Freising, among others, had such schools. The next major moment in the development of contemporary universities grew out of these monastic cathedral schools with the formation of studia or studio generale, whose aim was to educate students beyond the level of the monastic or cathedral schools. The first use of the term appears in the beginning of the 13th century. These schools were defined by 3 values. The school attracted and invited students beyond the locale. It provided advanced studies in at least one of the areas of theology, law, or medicine. And these disciplines were taught by a cohort of teachers of advanced learning, commonly referred to as the masters. These groups of masters eventually organized themselves into guilds, similar to those of the merchant and craft guilds that began forming with the growth of cities starting in the 10th and 11th centuries. Teachers who were registered in the Guild of Masters of the Studia Generale eventually gained the privilege of being able to teach in any other studia without the need for an examination. This privilege was originally preserved for the masters of only 3 studies: Paris, known for the excellence in theology and arts, Salerno, known for excellence in medicine, and Bergamo, known for law. But it was gradually expanded to include faculties at other studia if the school was able to secure a special papal bull. Of particular interest to us here at Mount St. Mary College is an important episode in our Dominican family history. In 1219, Pope Honorius III had invited Saint Dominic to Rome and gave him and the newly founded order of preachers the ancient Roman Basilica of Santa Sabina to be used as a convent for the reformation of women religious in the city of Rome, which Saint Dominic was to supervise. There, Saint Dominic set up a studium conventual, which became the first studium of the order of preachers. Later, the Dominicans would establish a studium generale at the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, and in 1288 transferred theological studies from Santa Sabina to Santa Maria sopra Minerva, eventually creating the studium generale for the whole order of preachers of the Roman province. In due course, this studium would grow and be transformed into the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, which is commonly called the Angelicum. So I had the honor and pleasure of visiting, what we could probably say the mother school of all Dominican schools, the Angelicum in Rome. And there I am with Father Alejandro Crosby, who's visited our campus several times as Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Angelicum. It was from this organization of masters within the Studio Generale that the idea of a university emerged. The Latin term universitas denoted a group of association of individuals of a particular guild. Eventually, the term more narrowly defined a group in terms of a guild of scholars. Originally, the term designated not a building or a school as such, but the association of masters and students pursuing a certain course of studies. For example, an association entitled the Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarum, a guild of masters and scholars, grew up around Notre Dame Cathedral, which eventually became the University of Paris. The masters of a scholars guild prescribed the course of studies for a particular discipline, and thus emerged the faculties of theology, medicine, and law. These early associations of scholars did not possess buildings or libraries, but they were legally recognized and were self-governing associations that had the right to confer degrees that entitled the recipients the right to teach or a license to teach that discipline. Eventually, no studium generale would be able to confer degrees or a license to teach without papal or imperial approval. In the course of subsequent centuries, these associations of scholars and students became more and more formalized, resulting in what we now know as higher education. Some key developments in this process was official recognition by the group of either civil or church authorities, which required the formulation of statutes. For example, the University of Paris had statutes by 1208 and became recognized as a corporate body in 1211. Eventually, the faculties of theology, canon law, medicine were established, as well as the lower faculty of the arts. The university's faculties were supervised by a dean, and the university was presided over by a rector. University matters were decided by a vote of teaching faculty. Students were admitted around the age of 14 to the Faculty of Arts, where they studied for 7 years for their bachelor's degree. The degree was only an apprenticeship before the student could enroll in a mastership at the age of 20. Students were free to select whichever master they so desired and chose the hall in which they would reside, although it was not required that students live under the supervision of a master. It was not until the 15th century when Paris and Oxford compelled students to reside in a particular college or a hall supervised by a master. Thus, we have the origin of what we now know as the dorms. The university system continued to grow and develop in the major cities of Europe and spread to England. John Scott identifies 3 major stages in the development that correspond to the development of Western civilization and world history. They are the pre-nation state, the nation state, and the global stage. Each is distinguished by a specific characteristic or aim. The pre-nation state, which is what I have just described, and is characterized by a strong teaching emphasis on the scholastic method of instruction and a curriculum focused on the traditional sub and liberal arts. The nation state stage began around the 16th century. At this stage, universities began to have 3 basic missions: nationalization, democratization, and public service. With the rise of the strong monarchies and the establishment of the nation states, many universities came under state or local political control, wherein the state could appoint chancellors, dictate course and curriculum decisions, and carry out inspection visitations. Universities were expected to serve government interests by preparing students for civil and diplomatic service through the study of secular and practical subjects. The historian Redding sees the mission and focus of the university at this time as one that is socio-political, that is, The university is, quote, an ideological arm of the state for training either, quote, monarchical subjects or Republican citizens, end quote, such that the state protects the action of the university and the university safeguards the thought of the state. Despite this increased control and influence by government and rulers, and some degree church officials, faculty still retain control over many of the internal decisions of the university. This period was also marked by European exploration and colonization, and this system can still be found in many Latin American countries where higher education is sponsored and supported by the state. Due to the influence of the Italian Renaissance, the curriculum of universities also changed during the nation-state stage. The scholastic method of the medieval universities gradually gave way to humanistic studies such as literature, ancient languages, pagan Greek and Roman culture. The use of vernacular language increased, dissemination of ideas was made easier due to the newly invented printing press, and faculty began to make presentations of their original research, which eventually generated the contemporary idea of specialization in certain fields of study. Scott credits this shift to a more secular and humanistic orientation to paving the way for the scientific revolution of the 17th century, the Enlightenment of the 18th century, and the formulation of what we today consider a liberal arts curriculum. What emerged was a focus on producing well-rounded students. One important development that emerged during the latter part of this stage is the German model of higher education. The founding of the University of Berlin in 1810 by the Prussian state helped to increase focus on professionalized graduate level teaching in science, law, medicine, and topics related to civil service. Moreover, it established a funding stream for higher education across Germany, paid for by the government. Begun by Wilhelm von Humboldt, the University of Berlin was set up to, quote, appoint the best intellects available and give them the freedom to carry out their research wherever it leads. This vision resulted in an outcome that eventually permeated German universities. These are teaching and original research were now viewed as essential characteristics of higher education. 2, the concept of academic freedom. And 3, increased status for faculty in arts and sciences, the traditional humanities, as being on par with those of theology, law, and medicine, the traditional 3 major fields of discipline. Faculty were strongly encouraged to conduct original research in all disciplines, and eventually the German system of the state-run higher education began to attract foreign students and visiting professors from across Europe and the new country of the United States, something that I'll refer to later in this talk. The founding of the United States in the mid-18th century eventually ushered in novel ideas concerning the nature of higher education. And the fledgling republic was to survive, then it would need leaders who would be able to promote the values that inspired the American Revolution, liberty and self-government. Like their European counterparts, American higher education would provide service to the state in the way it gradually and slowly unfolded in the American ideal of democratization. But unlike the European counterparts, the United States never instituted a national university. The development of higher education in this country evolved from the local, state, or sectarian interest. 10 of the nation's founders were also founders of academic institutions, most notably Jefferson and the University of Virginia, which he intended as a non-denominational place of higher learning, although he did intend that divinity schools or theology schools would be set up close to the campus, and so religious learning, discipline, teaching would still occur. As the country expanded westward to the Pacific, the Morel Act of 1862 established land grants of federal property that provided states with revenue, and those states west of the Appalachians to establish colleges specializing in agriculture and mechanical arts. Later, the Morel Act of 1890 would provide federal funding to new and existing state college and authorize funding for Black land-grant colleges and universities. If land-grant schools refused admission to students based upon race, they were required to establish parallel institutions. And of course, this is a great debate, something that we need to reconcile with given our focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I can say from the research that there's so much there to explore of how American higher education was in the process of democratization, but how certain groups of Americans were shut out, basically. And so I think that's a point that we have to emphasize, that it really is a great story, but also a story that we still need to come to terms with. The late 19th and 20th century began to recognize what we now call adult education through the Chautauqua movement. This idea was originally begun by Lewis Miller, an Ohio businessman, and John Vincent, a Methodist bishop, as a way to train Sunday school teachers in all Protestant denominations. The program began here in New York on the shores of Lake Chautauqua, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in 1872. And it gradually evolved to a countrywide movement that engendered an appreciation for art, music, and theater in small towns across the United States. Women, working adults, and the elderly were attracted to the education and cultural programs sponsored by the movement. Although it eventually died out in the early 20th century, its lasting contribution in the development of American higher education was the focus on lifelong learning. American higher education in the 20th century saw major developments. The scientific and agricultural programs grew and developed, especially in the state schools. Colleges and universities faced increasing costs associated with research. Philanthropic relationships beyond the traditional revenue streams of government funding, alumni donations, and tuition dollars began to develop. Colleges and universities started partnerships with private industries and outside foundations to secure funding to support their research efforts. Examples of such ventures are Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the School of Aeronautics at the California Institute of Technology. These research interests in the fields of science and technology proved invaluable during World War II, when the federal government partnered with research universities to do research for the war effort. The advancement of technology eventually resulted in new ideas and opportunities for enlarging the scope and the extent by which colleges and universities could fulfill their mission and attract a greater and more diverse body of students. Through the internet, colleges and universities are no longer bounded by the traditional in-person classroom experience, something that the COVID pandemic has all forced us to come to terms with. Universities can now offer educational opportunities across the planet to a broad range of students. An example of this model is Penn State's World Campus, which began online in 1998 and has 20,000 students and offers 175 degree and certificate programs to students across the globe. Scott identifies this new model as the multiversity and has a threefold mission: teaching, research, and public service. This foregoing summary, perhaps lengthy, but tried to condense it as best as I could, 1,000 years, has highlighted how contemporary American higher education is the product of a confluence of intellectual and political forces. On one hand, academia helped to influence the course of world history through its cultivation and teaching of the disciplines related to arts and letters, empirical and social sciences, and technological innovation. It provided the impetus for original scholarly research and promoted the values of freedom of thought and academic autonomy. On the other hand, politics and civil society helped to shape these efforts and provide the necessary resources to practically fulfill these objectives. The roots of this development lie in the monastic and cathedral schools of the Christian religion and religious devotion to Christian faith. However, the number of institutions of higher education in the United States that have any religious affiliation now is in the minority, and this is the topic to which I now turn. Religion in American higher education. The first institution of higher education, what we now call the United States of America, is Harvard University, which was founded in 1636 with an expressly religious and civil purpose. Although Harvard's religious mission was rooted in Protestantism, it was not narrowly construed. At the time of its founding, Oxford and Cambridge still required students to profess adherence to the 39 Articles of the Anglican Church, but Harvard had no such requirement, and the works of a variety of Protestant theologians could be found in its library, as well as those of St. Thomas Aquinas and other Catholic theologians. Harvard's commitment to a Christian education was clearly demonstrated by its requirements that scriptures were read daily, and students were to be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well that the main end of his life and studies is to know God in Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, John 17:3. And therefore to lay Christ in the bottom as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning. So on the handout, I have these excerpts directly taken from the founding mission of Harvard University. The historian Bernard Kohlherner observes that all the colleges of the American colonial period began with the same religious ethos that inspired the founding of Harvard. Among these are William and Mary, Yale, of which we already spoke, Princeton, Columbia, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth. By the time of the Civil War, there were 182 permanent colleges in the United States, and of these, 175 were under the control of religious denominations. These included the Methodists, Baptists, Quakers, Lutherans, Episcopalians, Universalists, and Catholics. Although there were attempts to found Jewish colleges, they were unsuccessful, but theological seminaries in the Jewish faith were established. The denominational or sectarian schools often had clergy as presidents and professors, required chapel exercises, and regular instruction in the Bible. The development of the state schools in the mid-19th century motivated religious denominations to establish more denominational schools, and religious groups even tried to exercise influence over the state schools. For example, the Presbyterians had taken over control of the State School of Vincennes University, and then tried to do the same at the State School of Indiana University in Bloomington. As the United States expanded westward, graduates of East Coast denominational schools caught a missionary spirit. They headed to the American frontier to establish sectarian schools that would ensure the newly acquired territory would be preserved from, quote, atheism, infidelity, the slaveholder, and the Pope. As the American experiment unfolded, the delicate balance between the free exercise of religion and the state impacted the development of faith-based schools. Constitutional and legal prohibitions prevented the use of tax money for religious schools based upon the First Amendment. And in 1827, Massachusetts was the first state to prohibit public funding of religious instruction. The state of Michigan went so far as to forbid private colleges from granting degrees. But there was also a landmark victory for religious schools in the Dartmouth College case of 1819. In this case, the state of New Hampshire tried to gain control of Dartmouth College, which was a Christian college founded with the intent to convert Native Americans. The case ended up at the US Supreme Court, which ruled that a college charter was a contract that could not be changed without the consent of the college. American Catholic higher education. The first Catholic institution of higher learning established in the United States was Georgetown College in 1786, now known as Georgetown University. Under the direction of Bishop John Carroll of Baltimore, the school was originally intended to be a school for the, quote, education of youth and the perpetuity of a body of clergy in this country. Contemporaneously, in 1791, Bishop Carroll had founded St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore, which was to serve exclusively as a seminary for the training of priests. This effort was greatly helped because of the French Revolution, which saw the displacement of French Sulpicians, who expressed apostolate was the theological preparation of diocesan priests. Ironically, the number of students entering priestly formation was quite low, and the seminary ended up creating a college for lay students that lasted up until 1852. Thus, the two original institutions of Catholic higher education in the United States, Georgetown University and St. Mary's Seminary, shared the educational aims of their Protestant counterparts in preparing students for ministry and also for non-ministerial careers. However, this dual purpose would eventually become unnecessary. The Council of Trent had established seminaries for the training of priests. As the Catholic population in the United States grew, the church would establish seminaries for priestly formation, and the educational focus of Catholic colleges and universities would shift almost exclusively to the education of lay students. So my very first job out of college was teaching at St. John's High School with the French Christian Brothers on Military Road in Washington. And I also served as a prefect of discipline at Georgetown Prep. That spring of my year there was the inauguration of the bicentennial of Georgetown Prep. So as a saver, this was the program that they released in the spring of 1988 that was going to be followed by the year-long bicentennial celebration. And so there's a picture of me on the left with my little Hoyas of my dorm floor. So I always wonder whatever happened to some of them, right? The success of Catholic institutions of higher learning prior to the Civil War was not stellar. In his study on the topic, Powers found that, quote, of 42 Catholic colleges established before 1850, only 10 became permanent. Georgetown, Mount St. Mary's, St. Louis, Spring Hill, Xavier in Ohio, Fordham, Notre Dame, Holy Cross, Villanova, and St. Vincent's in Pennsylvania. However, Protestant schools did not fare much better. Tewksbury's study on the topic found that 80% of the colleges founded by non-Catholics did not survive. The surge of Catholic European immigration in the latter part of the 19th century was perhaps the greatest impetus for the growth of Catholic education in the United States. With the exception of the Irish immigrants, the majority of Catholic immigrants arriving from Europe were unable to speak English. Once they settled in America, with the approval of their bishop, they established personal or ethnic parishes where they could worship in their native language. These parishes spread across the United States and not only addressed their spiritual needs, but helped these immigrants and their families navigate economic injustice, as well as cultural and societal prejudice that they experienced in a predominantly Protestant country. The second important factor that cultivated a vast network of Catholic education was the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore that was held in 1866. The Catholic bishops of the United States mandated that every parish erect a parochial school, and that in hiring faculty, preference should be given to members of religious communities. As we all know, Mount St. Mary College's story is part of this episode in American history. From the mid-19th century into the mid-20th century, a vast number of schools from elementary to university level were established by many religious orders of the Catholic Church, such as the Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans, and Benedictines. It was through the hard work and determination of these women and men committed to the educational mission of the Church that generations of poor Catholic immigrants would rise from poverty into the American middle and upper class. While American Catholic higher education continued to have steady growth and developed an extensive educational system for promoting and preserving the faith for future generations, the schools founded by Protestant denominations began to separate from the religious roots and foundation. There are several reasons offered for this divorce. The first is attributed to the growth of the state and land grant schools that emphasize scientific and technical courses that created an intellectual environment that championed the empirical sciences and tended to diminish or at least eclipse the value of courses directed to spirituality or religion. The focus on scientific research, as was mentioned before, was a particular innovative focus of the German state-run universities. Many American academics had studied at the University of Berlin in the 19th century and brought this spirit back to the United States and infused it in the schools at which they taught or served as administrators. Kohlberner, whom I've referred to before, points out that in 1876, when Johns Hopkins University was opened, the main speaker was Thomas Huxley, who had promoted Darwin's Origin of the Species. This event marked the first time in the United States history that a prominent cleric or churchman was not present for a significant educational event. Another contributing factor that led to this disassociation of religion and education was the vast sums of money were beginning to be donated by large philanthropic organizations to non-denominational schools. Many sectarian schools dropped their religious identity in order to receive these funds. And finally, the strength of creedal Protestantism began to decline, and the relationship between schools and denominations that founded them began to weaken. In the first part of the 20th century, many sectarian schools became non-sectarian and secular. At best, they may still use the term church-related to describe any sectarian origin, but it has little significant or universal meaning. With the connection between faith and higher education began to separate in American sectarian schools, new energy and perspectives were infused in Catholic education in the mid-20th century when John XXIII called the Second Vatican Council in 1962. The gathering of Catholic bishops from across the world who met in the Vatican studied, debated, and recommended ways that the Church could best address the needs of contemporary society. The council sessions lasted from 1962 until 1965 and included non-Catholics as well, as the Church saw an urgent need not only to reinvigorate its own internal life, but also to strengthen ties of unity among all denominations of Christians and all people of goodwill. Although the Second Vatican Council was not a dogmatic council, insofar as no doctrinal or essential church teaching was changed or promulgated, it did signal a radical shift of perspective and approach in how the church saw itself and how it related to society at large. The council produced one document exclusively devoted to the topic of Christian education, entitled Gravissimum Educationis, or the Declaration on Christian Education. It was published in October of 1965. The document stated that, quote, all men of every race, condition, and age, since they enjoy the dignity of a human being, have an inalienable right to an education, and that all Christians have a right to a Christian education. This obligation is primarily fulfilled by parents, whom the church sees as the primary and principal educators, and the family as the first school of social virtues. Parents also have a primary and inalienable right to educate their children in schools of their own choice, and society and the church have a moral obligation in helping them do so. Education in general should address the intellectual, moral, and physical capacities of the students, using the latest advances in psychology, arts, sciences, and even provide, quote, positive and prudent sexual education. In particular, Christian education must transmit the truths of the faith and the mystery of salvation, helping students come to a deeper realization of the gift of faith and how to worship God. The aim of Christian education, according to the document, is ultimately to prepare students for professional and civic engagement and to deepen their spiritual lives. Interestingly, when specifically addressing the nature and culture of Catholic schools, the document states that they aid the church by, quote, fostering a dialogue between the church and mankind to the benefit of both, end quote. As such, the church recognizes that each discipline will investigate and research according to its own principles and method, and enjoys, quote, the liberty of scientific inquiry. As such, investigations yield new knowledge, propose new questions, and this work should be carried out in light of the principle of the harmony between faith and reason, as illustrated by the fathers of the church and especially St. Thomas Aquinas. Subsequent to the council, two more documents have an important impact in shaping and affirming the vital role that Catholic higher education has for the church in the United States. They are the Land O'Lakes Statement and Ex Corde Ecclesiae. In 1967, under the leadership of Father Theodore Hesburgh, president of Notre Dame University and president of the International Federation of Catholic Universities, two meetings were convened in Land O'Lakes, Wisconsin, that was comprised of leaders in Catholic higher education, including university administrators, bishops, and leaders of religious communities that sponsored schools. They discussed the nature and role of contemporary Catholic university, and the document that issued from that meeting is entitled The Idea of the Catholic University, more commonly referred to as the Land O'Lakes Statement. Although the document was preliminary and intended as a preparatory one for the 1968 international meeting, representing only the views of a handful of individuals, its vision and values gradually became mainstream in American Catholic higher education. It was primarily focused on problems encountered within large universities and not smaller liberal arts colleges or small universities. Among the essential values outlined in the document was a firm and powerful commitment to academic excellence and academic freedom in the face of any authority outside the academic community. It describes the academic community as, quote, a community of learners or a community of scholars in which Catholicism is perceptibly present and effectively operative, end quote. This goal is achieved primarily in the deference accorded to the discipline of theology as a legitimate intellectual discipline and essential to the life of a Catholic university. The purview of the theologian is not limited to the Christian tradition, but also investigates, quote, the total religious heritage of the world, as well as ecumenical topics. Theology is expected to enter into robust and fruitful interdisciplinary dialogue in order to respond to the needs of the contemporary world. In terms of the other academic disciplines, the statement makes an emphatic statement about autonomy of scholarship. And so I refer to item number 4 in the handout. So quoting from the Land O'Lakes Statement, in a Catholic university, all recognized university areas of study are frankly and fully accepted, and their internal autonomy affirmed and guaranteed. There must be no theological or philosophical imperialism. All scientific and disciplinary methods and methodologies must be given due honor and respect. The whole world of knowledge and ideas must be open to the student. There must be no outlawed books or subjects. Thus, the student will be able to develop his own capabilities and to fulfill himself by using the intellectual resources presented to him. So go Libraries Week, no banned books. In a Catholic, echoing the thoughts of Gravissimum Educationis, the Catholic University provides a service to the Church as it serves as a locus or a place for the Church to engage in critical and self-reflective thinking about itself. Thus, Catholic universities contribute in an essential and significant way to the intellectual life of the Church as a whole. Care and attention must also be paid to the ultimate questions of life properly suited to the disciplines of philosophy and theology, as well as the spiritual and personal development of the student by encouraging participation in the liturgical and sacramental life of the Church and active engagement on issues related to social justice. Although the Land O'Lakes statement was not a binding document for Catholic institutions of higher learning, nor a document issued by the magisterium of the Church, its vision and values had a major impact on Catholic higher education across the United States. More than 50 years later, there is still debate whether or not its position has best served the teaching mission of the Church. Many criticize the document, and still do, as having a deleterious impact on Catholic higher education by weakening the oversight that religious orders and local bishops often exercised over the academy. Some see the document as actually opening the door and promoting the type of a situation that presently characterized schools like Harvard and Yale that disassociated themselves from their Christian roots and mission. As one professor from Notre Dame once told me, quote, Notre Dame's Catholic identity is like a Catholic parish in a secular neighborhood. There's a Catholic parish, but it isn't a Catholic neighborhood. I haven't visited Notre Dame, so I really can't say. I'm just saying what a Notre Dame professor had said about the campus culture at Notre Dame. Another critical perspective on the document is that it was born out of a certain inferiority complex that Catholic universities felt in relation to their non-sectarian counterparts. Catholic education was popularly viewed as insular and parochial in the worst sense of the term. The real motivation of those who drafted the document desired to recreate Catholic higher education so that it would more align with the profile of large research institutions. The priority was to create a secular version of Catholic higher education by sacrificing traditional Catholic values. Criticism was not limited to the document itself, but spilled over into criticism of Father Hesper. Many reproached him for the transformation of American Catholic higher education that the document envisioned, especially at Notre Dame. The argument is that the document led to a weakened commitment to authentic Catholic teaching and provided cover and legitimacy to theologians and those in the Church who dissented with Catholic teaching, especially in the areas of sexual morality. Rather than promoting and inculcating authentic Catholic faith and morals, the Catholic University now became a place where those values could be openly criticized, ultimately ridiculed, and discarded, all in the name of academic freedom. The result was that students left Catholic higher education with less certainty and commitment to their faith than when they first entered. On the other hand, the Land O'Lakes statement did resonate with a vast majority who were engaged in Catholic higher education, from bishops, leaders of religious congregations that sponsored Catholic colleges and universities, boards of trustees, faculty, and administrators. Its vision was a departure from the way that Catholic colleges and universities had seen themselves and how they operated. In the centuries after the Protestant Reformation and with the rise of secular and the democratic state, the Church adopted a defensive and almost militant posture toward non-Catholics. Even more problematic was the Church's relationship with non-Christians, especially Jews, who were often vilified and considered outcasts of Christian Europe. To some extent, Catholic education had absorbed some of this ethos, as Catholic schools were not only established to provide students with an education appropriate for matriculation into a job or career, but also to ensure that students thoroughly understood the Catholic faith by taking required courses in religion and mandatory attendance at liturgical celebrations. The objective was to ensure that Catholic students would not, quote, be corrupted by the ideas of Protestantism or drift away from the faith. For example, at Mount St. Mary College, opened in 1963, the core general education required 14 credits in theology and 14 credits in philosophy. So this is from Mount St. Mary's College catalog, 1963 to 1964. These combined 28 credits in theology and philosophy, mind you, not religious studies, but Catholic theology. These 28 combined credits surpassed the combined credit hours for English and social science, which only had 24. And even until 1970, Mount St. Mary College's college catalog included excerpts from Vatican II's Declaration on Christian Education and prescribed what religious studies courses Catholic students would take, and offering non-Catholic students the option to substitute philosophy courses for religious studies courses. So I kind of find this interesting that our college catalog actually quoted Second Vatican Council. So I think this might be one of my proposals to our curriculum committee that the next time they meet, we need to get a few more church documents in our college catalog. We'll see how that goes over. In addition, the hierarchy of the church had exercised almost exclusive control over all aspects of official church activities, including Catholic schools. This was often exercised through the religious orders that founded and conducted the schools. For example, when Mount St. Mary College opened in 1963, the honorary chairman of the Board of Trustees was Cardinal Spellman. Bishop Griffiths, Monsignor Voigt, the Secretary for Education for the Archdiocese, and 12 Dominican sisters all served on the board. So again, from our first college catalog, we can see the composition of our Board of Trustees. And so I think the criticism that Catholic higher education was in some sense parochial or insular is not just off the cuff. We see this. Many saw the Land O'Lakes statement as a way for Catholic higher education to relax the tight control that the church had over curriculum, faculty hires, and administration. In short, the statement had opened up the possibility for changing the ways things had been done, and things did, in fact, change. Even a passing survey of the Catholic colleges and universities in the United States today reveals that their mission and culture reflect the vision and values of the Land O'Lakes statement proposed. Of course, I would argue that other factors contributed to this change. Among them, I would include the emphasis on the active participation of the laity in the life of the church that the Second Vatican Council called for. The steep decline in religious vocations within the religious congregations that began schools and colleges, and the necessity for curriculum changes due to societal and economic factors, as well as the need for schools to be competitive in attracting and retaining students. Perhaps the one testimonial to the legacy of Father Hesburgh and the Land O'Lakes statement is that the highest award given to an individual who has made an outstanding contribution and rendered extended service to Catholic higher education by the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities, what we refer to as the ACCU, is named the Hesburgh Award. This past February, the president of Dominican University, our sister institution in River Forest, Illinois, Donna Carroll, received that award. The controversy on the value of the Land O'Lakes statements will no doubt continue as a debate, as evaluation and commentary are part of the fabric of higher education itself. Bringing it home, the last significant document that I draw attention to is the Apostolic Constitution on Catholic Universities, written by John Paul II in 1990, entitled Ex Corde Ecclesiae, translated as From the Heart of the Church. Unlike the Land O'Lakes statement, which was written as a vision or a statement paper concerning the nature of Catholic universities, an apostolic constitution is a formal pronouncement by the Pope on matters of doctrine or discipline concerning some issue within the church, and it is the highest level of legislative document issued by a Pope. As such, it has binding force on Catholic colleges and universities in a way that the Land O'Lakes statements does not. In fact, the Land O'Lakes statement explicitly refers to itself and says that it does not, quote, pretend to present a full philosophy or description of the Catholic University. It is selectively and deliberately incomplete, end quote. However, it is interesting to note that many of the values found in the Land O'Lakes statement are echoed in Ex Corde Ecclesiae. Among them are academic autonomy, the integration of disciplines through theology, a Catholic college's mission to address the intellectual, moral, and personal lives of students, and the commitment to service. As a papal document governing the norms of Catholic higher education, the document is divided into two main sections. The first deals with the mission and values of Catholic higher education itself, but the second half is more relevant to bishops and church law concerning the setting up and operation of Catholic institutions of higher learning. Here, for our purpose, I'm only going to focus on the first part. In stating the nature and purpose of Catholic higher education, John Paul situates the topic within the historical reality of the church itself. He cites St. Augustine, who observed that there was a joy in discovering and communicating truth, gaudium de veritate. and that the Catholic University aims to cultivate a life of faith in order to come to deeper understanding, and cultivating understanding in order to edify the life of faith, sometimes referred to as I believe in order to understand, and I understand in order to believe. These are not mutually exclusive endeavors, but complementary, as the human person is essentially both rational and spiritual. As such, the Catholic University has a mission to explore truths known through the use of human reason, but also those that are revealed through faith. It carries out this mission through the primary task of teaching, research, and service. And these activities are imbued with a Christian Catholic ethos, which recognizes a transcendent, ultimate purpose to human existence. John Paul makes two important observations concerning Catholic higher education that reflect the Land O'Lakes statement. The first is that the Catholic University possesses institutional autonomy, and that each discipline conducts research or study according to the principles and objective aims of that discipline. So again, I'll refer to the handout, numbers 5 and 6. So quoting from Ex Corde, a Catholic university possesses the autonomy necessary to develop its distinctive identity and pursue its proper mission. Freedom in research and teaching is recognized and respected according to the principles and methods of each individual discipline, so long as the right of the individual and of the community are preserved within the confines of the truth and the common good. Number 6, a Catholic university therefore is a place of research where scholars scrutinize reality with the methods proper to each academic discipline, and so contribute to the treasury of human knowledge. The search for truth is not an end in itself, but is intimately linked to the service and the good of the individual and to the human community as a whole. Catholic higher education must probe fundamental questions about the meaning of human existence in relation to those discoveries that human reason pursues. That is, it must frame questions ultimately in light of the total reality of the human person that include not only the intellectual capacities of the human person, but also the ethical and spiritual dimensions of human life. In addition to its primary objective to be a place of teaching and research, the Catholic University is a community that should be animated with freedom and charity, and where the freedom of conscience of each person is to be fully respected. This includes both Catholics and non-Catholics. The community is comprised of teachers, students, directors, and administrators, the religious communities that founded them, and the laity. The spirit of mutual charity is viewed as a necessary condition for fostering dialogue among its members, and helps, quote, each of its members to achieve wholeness as a human person, end quote. Through its essential activities of research and teaching, the Catholic University renders vital service to the church and society as it investigates problems impacting humanity and in promoting social justice. Practically speaking, this occurs when the university communicates ethical and religious principles and provides programs of continuing education and engages in dialogue with other institutions of higher learning to advance understanding of various cultures, both within and outside the church, and to address ecological concerns. Last, the Catholic University is a place of spiritual formation that is carried out through pastoral ministry and many non-academic activities that are found in campus life. The university strives to integrate faith with life. The primary mission of the church is the proclamation of the gospel, and in a unique way, the Catholic University is an instrument of evangelization, not only to its own members, but to society as a whole. Just as the Land O'Lakes statement met with criticism, so did Ex Corde Ecclesiae. Because the document was an apostolic constitution and referred to provisions in the Code of Canon Law, many saw it as a way to turn back or at least stem the liberalizing of Catholic higher education, especially in the United States. The document was a way that the hierarchy of the church could reassert its legitimate authority over academic institutions that claim to be Catholic. On this point, it is interesting to note that Ex Corde Ecclesiae states, and this I believe is number 8 in the handout, so this is in Ex Corde, the responsibility for maintaining and strengthening the Catholic identity of the university rests primarily with the university itself. And so I think the document is very clear that not only faculty and the research and scholarship that is carried out at Catholic universities enjoys the autonomy within that discipline, but also that the university, the institution also has its own autonomy in how it articulates and lives out its Catholic mission and identity. This point reflects the principle of subsidiarity, which is fundamental to Catholic social teaching. The practical means of establishing the ways and means that an individual school will relate to official church authority is something that will be particular, as each operates within a certain cultural and political context and has its own history and campus culture. Perhaps because of this, the one positive consequence of Ex Corde Ecclesiae is that it was a global call for Catholic colleges and universities to re-evaluate their identity. 25 years had passed since Vatican II's declaration on Christian education. And so taking an inventory on how the transformation in higher education ushered in by the council seemed appropriate. Many institutions found a renewed appreciation for their Catholic identity within and through the charism of the religious orders that founded them. What gradually emerged was a common vision of Catholic higher education that was rooted in the essential values of the complementarity of faith and reason, the cultivation of moral and spiritual values, and the fostering of an ethos of service. But it was no longer a monolithic vision. There was a greater respect and appreciation for the diversity that existed in American Catholic higher education and for the unique perspective and contribution that each school makes in the teaching mission of the church. For us at Mount St. Mary College, this vision is well articulated in A Vision in the Service of Truth, a document that is the product of a collaborative reflection on the Dominican tradition and the values of prayer, study, community, and service that serve as the pillars and guides for the mission of Dominican higher education here in the United States. It is important to note that this document is not and cannot be the final word or vision. As the document itself states, it is only, quote, a conversation starter, and that each Dominican institution is called to engage in dialogue, research, and exploration of how it can, quote, articulate the richness of the Dominican tradition, end quote. And I would also add that this will require some respectful disputatio, as we all know, we'd like to enjoy in the academic setting. I know, say respectful disputatio. It is my hope that my presentation has offered a greater appreciation for the nature, development, and mission of Catholic higher education in the United States, and that we all leave with a renewed or strengthened commitment to our teaching mission in the Dominican tradition. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Josh. Stop the screen share right over here. And anyone in the chat, if you happen to have any questions, you can go ahead and type those into the chat or use the raise hand feature in order to ask a question. Anyone here in the room have any questions for our presenter here today? I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
So I heard a lot about interdisciplinary dialogues and this document, a conversation starter. I'd like to hear your perspective on what conversations maybe you would like to see occurring here at the Mount. I think that you touched on a couple of themes that we've heard around campus before, but what's your perspective?
So in terms of the dialogue, in terms of our Catholic identity and mission, yes, I think that this is something that, at least since my time here, to speak veritas, that has always been sort of the elephant in the room. And I understand this elephant has been living in the room for a long time, even before I arrived here. And I think it is because, in my estimation, again, we all have our perspective. I think that Mount St. Mary College, when the dialogue on Ex Corde had transpired across most of Catholic higher education in the United States of America, from what I could see from my research, and I'm not saying my research is exhaustive, but I don't see that conversation as ever having taken place here. And I don't know what was the reason for that, but I think, our recent Middle States report calls us out on that. It says, like, you need to have a clear, open, frank discussion about your mission and your identity. And I guess it's 4 or 5 years since we had the Middle States report. And I haven't seen any movement of the ball on the field with that. So, and I think it's that perhaps a greater appreciation for these 3 documents, on the dignity of on Christian education, on the Land O'Lakes statement, as well as Ex Corde, should be an essential part of that conversation. And so at least in terms of our mission and identity, I think that's important. And I think what has really fostered that dialogue, which will be happening this summer, is that the Dominican colloquium. Because oftentimes I think that whenever somebody proposes a topic for discussion, which I think is our human nature, there's a sort of prejudice there that we assume, well, this is what this person wants to talk about, or there's some hidden agenda here that's going to kind of corral us into a certain pen. And I think this is, to me, this is one of the best documents that Dominican higher education has released, because it's saying that this is not something that is coming from Mount St. Mary College, but it's Mount St. Mary College in union with the other Dominican schools. And so I think it should diffuse a sort of hesitancy to engage in this conversation, and to, say that this is our identity, this is who we are. And I think that's the other positive thing I see about the Initiative for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, is that one of the prime values of that discussion is to embrace your identity. And I think it would sort of be ironic that we want to speak about our identity, we want to celebrate identity and difference and diversity, and yet we're sort of hesitant to speak or promote our identity. And that it's not a monolithic perspective, but it's there's so much there to explore. So I guess if I would say there would be anything that I think would be important, is opening up more conversation on that topic. And maybe the CDI will be doing that in the near future. So.
Thank you. I'd like to give an opportunity for anybody else to ask any questions. Yes, absolutely.
You spoke about the DEI initiative, which I know you're so much a part of, and I wondered if you thought that initiative was a way to kind of combat the dissociation that there has been between, diversity and identity sort of issues and the Catholic intellectual tradition, or that you're seeing that the DEI conversations that have begun here, and also changes within your own home division, in anticipation for a philosophy major, is a way to suture, what has long been dissociated for, you said, a lot of them.
Right. No, that's yeah, it's a big topic, but I think one of the I think again, looking at it from a philosophical perspective, I mean, it's really at the heart of the Judeo-Christian philosophical perspective that God creates everyone, right? Every single one of, at least in that tradition, every single one is the son, daughter of God, right? And that God loves diversity. I mean, if we just look at the natural world, God is not boring, right? And so that to embrace that quality of diversity and learning different perspectives from different cultures and backgrounds, I think that's essential. I mean, that to me, that speaks to really what diversity is about. It's sort of being respectful to God and God's creation, and that, and I think it's true. There's sort of maybe has been a privileged place to some in that tradition. And again, that's for the historians to debate why it has happened. I don't know. I would certainly some of it has been intentional, but I would think some of it is unintentional. And I agree that I think it's incumbent that we draw that connection, because we might think that other schools are doing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so we're just kind of jumping on the bandwagon that's happening across the country. And but I don't see it that way. I see we are doing this because we're Catholic, not in spite of it, and that is not something that is apart from. So when we talk about curriculum decisions that my division will be making in terms of philosophy, theology, it's and I'm sure this is happening across our campus, is that it's an opportunity for all of us to explore this idea of the grandeur of God that creates a diversity of individuals, a diversity of cultures, and the greater appreciation for that. Of course, that's coming from a philosophical perspective, but I see it as a wonderful opportunity. But the important thing is that suturing is also to make those connections, because I think for some they might not see those connections.
We have one last question coming to us from the chat. Michael McGuire, go ahead.
Thank you. Charlie, I enjoyed the presentation. It was wonderful to see the broad historical perspective and your contributions. I'm curious about one aspect, and that is how this broader discourse specifically relates to institutions, Catholic institutions of higher education focused on educating women, because this is something that is very specific to much of the Catholic higher educational institutions in the United States. Do you see any specific suturing or salience for the issue of women in higher education and Catholic institutions of higher education?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Michael. And again, I have to tread lightly on this because you are the historian, so you probably know about the historical development far more than I do. But I would say the idea of single sex, are you referring to like single sex education, or just that it was more spearheaded by, say, the male hierarchy of the church to the exclusion of women?
Well, a bit of multiple things, that it is single sex education, it is at first male hierarchy, but it's increasingly within the United States, there is this effort to establish female religious institutions to generate degrees for American Catholic women in an American Catholic environment. And whether or not you see some of that older medieval synergy between faith and reason sort of resurrected in the American Women's College Catholic tradition.
So first of all, I'm unfamiliar with these new initiatives, but what I would speak to is that, and I think, there's legitimate criticism of, say, a strong patriarchal feel in the Catholic Church, due to the hierarchy and the magisterium being completely male. But to offset that, I would say, but it really was, say, in that monastic tradition, that those religious orders, the Benedictines, the Dominicans, always had the male and female. And separate education was not unique to Catholic institutions. I mean, we find that even in other denominations. So I think the question of single-sex education is much broader topic than simply a religious one. But I think within the Catholic tradition, and I will say this like often in my business ethics class, we speak about women's liberation or women sort of having a second place at the table, and I think that's a legitimate criticism. But also, I think we don't do a good job of highlighting, especially in the Catholic Church, the incredible contribution that women have made in the fields of healthcare, in education, in starting businesses. So like in my business ethics class, we talk about, women in business. But I look at these schools, hospitals, social service agencies that women religious started in this country, and they were running businesses, right? They were operating businesses. So I see that as a positive story in the development of Catholic education. And in terms of what new developments might be happening, I'm unaware of it. But again, and I think this we see with Pope Francis in his emphasis on speaking about women in the life of the church, and in fact, opening certain positions in the church that do not require a priest or to fulfill that position, and actually putting women in charge. So I guess, as we say in the church thinks in centuries. So certainly we're not, I guess, where everybody would like us to be. But at least it's something that, and I think is part of the legitimate dialogue, going back to the original question, is like these are the discussions that Catholic colleges and universities should engage in, because that is where the church does its teaching, and it should do so in a context which is respectful and based upon research, scholarship, and critical reflection. So I think what you're proposing is really an essential task as we move forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Dr. Charles Zola for joining us here today and sharing with us a little bit of his passion that's driving him. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right, we'll go ahead and end our recording here today. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you